Today, in part 5 of the series Building a Marriage, the topic is, I never knew he was like that. Just how do we love that stranger? And how do we tap into the tools the Bible supplies, the power of truth, love, grace, and the gospel? Here's Pastor Seth.
There was a husband and wife that had just an awful divorce. I mean, it was just nasty, and a lot of ill will and anger and bitter and lawyers and just a nightmare. And the husband was sitting in the home that they had lived in for about 10 years. His wife had moved out. She had her own apartment, but was really living with her boyfriend until the divorce became final. And and he was sort of bitter, angry about everything that had happened. He's sitting in his house thinking about this. 3 days before he has to move out, he gets his boxes and puts in his clothes and his books and computer stuff. And she got most of the stuff in the house, so he had to leave almost everything there. And then he paid a couple college kids the next day to come over and move his stuff to his new apartment. And on the day he had to move, that night, he decided to just sort of sit at the dining room table and kind of have a last meal. He bought a pound of shrimp, had that out there, had some caviar out there, opened a bottle of wine, had a couple glasses of wine. And when he finished his meal, then he opened up 3 cans of sardines. He mixed the shrimp that he had not eaten, the caviar he had not eaten, and the sardines together, kind of mixed them up in a bowl. And then he went into the living room and he took down the curtain rod, because the ex-wife and her boyfriend are going to be moving into the house the next day. He took down the curtain rod in the living room and took off the cap on end and reached into his bowl of sardines and caviar and shrimp and stuffed a bunch in there, and then rammed it down into the middle of that thing, put the cap back on, put it back up, put the curtains back up in the living room. He went into the dining room and did the same thing. Went into the master bedroom, did the same thing. Into both the other bedrooms, did the same thing. He left the key on the dining room table and left. He moved out. The next day, the ex-wife and her boyfriend gleefully moved back into the house, which she'd gotten in the divorce proceedings, with all the stuff in there, and her dream of being with her new love was about to unfold. But within a couple days, they noticed just this awful smell in the house. They couldn't figure out what it was, and they tried shampooing the carpets. They ended up calling, a few days later, a rodent guy to come in, and he went up in the attic looking for maybe a dead rat upstairs. They checked the vents. The guy couldn't find anything in the vents. They had the carpets professionally cleaned. They bought those air things and opened up the house. But every day, no matter what they did, it just seemed to be getting worse and worse and worse. It finally got to a place where not even the people that they'd hired to come help them would stay in the house for very long. It was that bad. They couldn't sleep at night. It was so bad. It just kept getting worse and worse and worse. They finally had the carpets ripped out, this nice wool carpet ripped out. That didn't help. And finally they realized, we can't live here. And so they put her on the market. But it was so bad, nobody would come in, and nobody would make an offer on it. They're saying, what in the world are we going to do? It's just kind of this nightmare unfolding for about a month. Well, about a month later, the ex-husband called the ex-wife, just checking up, seeing how you're doing. And the ex-wife got an idea. She said, well, we've decided that we want to start a new life ourselves, and we're going to buy a new house, and we're going to sell this one. And he said, oh, okay. And she said, would you be interested in buying it? He said, well, between the divorce settlement and the living on one income now, I couldn't possibly afford to buy our old house. She said, well, would you buy it for half? And he was kind of stunned by that, at least to her, on the phone. He said, but with the divorce settlement and my income, I still couldn't even afford that. And so over the next few minutes, she worked out a deal where they would change the divorce settlement, and he could buy the house for 20 cents on the dollar on one condition. that the papers were signed in his office within an hour, sight unseen, the house as is. He said, well, I really couldn't pass up. I never thought I'd be able to buy a house, but I really can't pass this up. And so he agreed to it. She hung up the phone just as delighted as she could be. Within an hour, the attorney had the papers. He signed, and the attorney called the ex-wife. And she was just this rich combination of delighted and relieved and just livid, because it seemed like he was getting the last little lash out of this situation. So the next day, the movers came, and they packed everything up. They got everything out of the house. And the boyfriend and the ex-wife were standing there looking at the house, and vacant house. And she got an idea. She was so mad at him. All this venom came back, this desire for revenge and to have the last word. And so in a last act of anger, she had her boyfriend take down all the curtain rods and throw them in the van. Some of you wrote that down as an idea. I could tell that. That wasn't meant to be an idea, a brainstorm session here. The title of today's message is, I Never Knew He Was Like That. Or you could change the pronouns, I never knew she was like that. Most people when they get married, they get married through that in-love euphoria. They are just so excited to be with this person. For the most part, all you see is this person's strengths and their positive attributes, and you sort of idealize the person and you idealize the relationship. But inevitably, in every marriage, the reality starts to set in. And you start to see not just this person's strengths, but their weaknesses. And not just their positive attributes, but their negative attributes. And then you realize there's really no place to escape. You really can't go home anymore because you are home. And sometimes this may take just a few weeks. Sometimes it take a month or a few months. I remember going through this myself, as I've shared in our series. And sometimes you think, did I really love the person? Did I really make the right decision in marrying this person? And sometimes it's worse. You think, I think I really messed up. I made the wrong decision. And you sort of say to yourself, I never knew he was like that or she was like that. Now, our first year of marriage, I remember having this sort of two images in my mind about myself as a young husband. The first image was I was on this slide that was pretty steep. And the slide was day by day or week by week, Mindy is finding out more about my negative attributes and my weaknesses. And no matter how hard I try to keep her from seeing those, she just keeps seeing them. They keep coming out. And I remember sort of like this is a slide so steep, I was just not going to be able to stop this at any particular time. And as I mentioned a few weeks ago, I remember the time when I thought, she's seen it all now. And I had this casual thought of, is she going to leave? Now, I knew she wouldn't leave because of her character, but that was kind of a scary thing for me. The second image I had beside the slide was, I sort of had the image of the story of Cinderella, except instead of being Cinderella, I was the prince. Cinderella was at the ball. She was in her gown. She had her tiara. She was this beautiful queen of the ball until about midnight. Now, she knew that at midnight, the whole facade would be over. But at least for a few hours, the only people that knew the real Cinderella were her wicked stepsisters. In my situation, when I got married, I was sort of the prince in the story with this difference. It appeared to me that there were no wicked stepsisters or no wicked stepbrothers or nobody that knew the dark side of me. It appeared to me that I had done a good job of hiding who I really was for about 26 years. And I had these different masks and character personas that I portrayed to people when I was out there in the real world, all that were meant to hide the real darker side of me from other people. Marriage is sort of like a mirror. It reveals who you really are to yourself. Sometimes we get irritated at our spouse because why does my spouse keep bringing up my weaknesses? Well, because they have to live with your weaknesses. And that's not a lot of fun. That's very discouraging. Sometimes you wonder, well, my spouse has changed so much. When I hear that, I want to say, well, duh. Of course. Marriage changes you. You used to be an independent person. Now you're called upon to be interdependent. You used to make all the decisions, great or small, on what you wanted to do. Those days are over on both great decisions and small decisions. If nothing else changed, that changes you. And it changes the person that your spouse has to relate to. One author calls this loving the stranger. Sometimes we think of this. I remember the spouse I married, but the person I'm married to now isn't the same person. Of course not. It's sort of like we are called to love a moving target as we go through life. Your kids change you. Just having a newborn changes you. If you get laid off, that changes you. If you have financial stresses, that changes you. If you have to manage money for the first time with somebody else who has a very different idea of budgeting than you, that changes you. All of these things have this progressive effect of changing you down through the years, and the challenge is to love the spouse that I'm married to today. Ephesians 5 says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, gave himself up for her, to make her holy. Now, this is the part where marriage is a lot like God's laboratory of taking our weaknesses and turning them into strengths. To make her holy. But I just wanted somebody to love me for who I am. Don't get married. Of course we want somebody to love us for who we are, but marriage is much bigger than that. To make her holy. This is changing her, taking weaknesses and making them strengths, taking our dark side and making us salt and light, putting on the Jesus Christ, cleansing her by the washing of water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish. Think about this. Nobody loves you like Jesus Christ does. Nobody loves you. Nobody knows every dark side about you than him, and yet he loves you the deepest, and at the same time, he's also committed to changing you. And he is very relentless about that. Every day, he is trying to change me. Now, we looked at this last week, building friendship in Christ, and that God often uses our spouse as sort of his laboratory assistant in the changing of me. And we talked about what are some images of this. The loyalist of friends who will hang in there with you even in your darker times. The grittiest of love is going to just fiercely hang on and love you no matter what they have to deal with. And we use the metaphor of the midwife, where Paul says, I was in labor until Christ be formed in you. That's this other side of marriage that our culture really doesn't see hardly at all. But when you have to talk to each other, that's what I want to do here. And you have to bring up weaknesses and discuss weaknesses. How do you do that without just putting a bomb into this thing? There are three important tools that every one of us are going to need. And putting this into practice is a lot harder than me talking about it. This is humbling. It takes discernment. It takes wisdom. It takes some sense, some common sense about you, a sense of timing. So I don't want you to hear three simple tools as if they're simple. But these are the tools you're going to need if you're going to navigate through, I never knew he was like that or she was like that. The first is the power of truth. Paul says, instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. The idea here is, though you do want somebody to love you, you also need somebody to speak truthfully to you about your weaknesses. That person has to live with you. And then you're called upon sometimes to do that with your spouse. God help you when you have to do that. Now, I want to say just a few little application type small things that are helpful, but I don't want to imply I'm trivializing this at all. But these are common mistakes we make. You want to make I statements and not you. You made me feel this way, as opposed to I felt. Or to assume the best. I'm sure you didn't mean to communicate this, but this is how I felt. You communicate the best. You don't draw conclusions prematurely. I may have been wrong is a good phrase to use in this kind of situation. This is just a thought. You don't have to respond. It's just something to think about. Maybe God has something for you here. Maybe it's just me. You don't put him on the spot. Or if you have to speak the truth, can you do it in 1 minute? If it takes you more than about a minute, you're not ready to speak the truth, likely. If it's going to take you 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 30 minutes or gust up to an hour, you are not ready to speak the truth. Please do not do that. Proverbs 9:8 talks about our response to getting truth. Constructive criticism, it's always constructive when you give it, but it's never constructive when somebody else gives it. Always seems destructive to me. Do not reprove a scoffer or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man and he will love you. That is a very challenging verse. Do not reprove a scoffer. Don't even bother, for he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, he will love you. I'm not saying that you're going to like it, but there is a sense of humility that I really need somebody to speak truth to me, and even though I don't like it, I need to hear it. Give instruction to a wise man, he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, he will increase in learning. Now, sometimes when we speak the truth, there are some people that come across like a bull in a china shop. You know who you are. But other times you may think you're coming across just as sweetly and meekly as you can. And yet the person is reacting to you, I think partly because of this. No matter how sweetly or nicely you think you're communicating truth, if in your heart of hearts, even unbeknownst to you, you have to have a change in the person, your spouse is going to know you well enough that they're going to say, you're just doing this for you. And they'll react. You're going to get nowhere. Things might end up being worse. The power of truth. Secondly is the power of love, the second tool you're going to need. And he says, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into him who is the head, that is Christ. Now, I don't know how often this happens, but it seems like in so many marriages, you've got one person who majors on the truth speaking, and you've got the other person that is deathly afraid of speaking the truth. They don't want any drama. They don't want any criticism. They don't want any arguments. They don't want any conflict. They're the in love part of this equation. Now, when Mindy and I got married, I was the second person. And even though I was, Carl the critical in my own head, I was loath to communicate these things to Mindy. Because I had learned, as growing up as a kid, that when you communicate things like this, it usually doesn't go well. You get nailed, you get criticized, it comes, who are you to tell me what to do? And those kind of situations, I grew up sort of being lost as to how to respond to those things. And the thing that I learned was you just sort of take, the things that you should say and maybe you should say, and you just kind of stuff it inside. Now, that worked for a while until those things you stuff inside becomes this awful smelly pit, and then I would just blow up like a volcano. Just and then all that stuff comes out. None of this is good. Speak the truth in love. Proverbs 29:25 again tells us one of the reasons why this is true. The fear of man lays a snare, but he who trusts in the Lord is safe. Fear of man here means I am really trusting what somebody else can say or do or relate to me in such a way that I feel validated. I feel important. We do this in our marriage. We did this growing up. There were times when I was in school where I wanted the validation of my dad or my mom. my baseball coach, football coach, friends. And it just seems like just this elusive trying to grasp something from somebody else. And what I didn't realize for a lot of years is what he says is this lays a snare, it lays a trap. I'm going to become a self-centered person, and in a way that makes complete sense to me to relate to the people in my life for my validation. This is not a good prescription for building strong relationships. This is no bueno. There was a guy that was having a tough time in his marriage, and he was talking with a friend and about this, and he realized he just kept looking for his wife to validate him, and he would do things at home that she would barely notice, wouldn't say hardly anything about it, wouldn't thank him, or sometimes she would criticize him. And as the friends were talking, the friend asked this guy, said, well, when you were growing up, did something like that ever happen to you? And at first the guy said, well, yeah, well, sort of. You know, I just kind of had a pretty good childhood. It really didn't, a lot of good things happen. You know, I didn't have it that bad. But I do remember being at a baseball game, and I wasn't that good a baseball player, but I was at the bottom of the lineup, and my dad was there to watch the game, and I was so excited. My dad was there, but I usually not too good. But this one particular time, pitch came over, I swung, I hit the ball square, and hit a home run. I'm running around the bases just as gleeful as I can, and this fellow's just telling the story like I am. Running around the bases till I got home. I hit home plate, and I looked up, and my dad was reading a book. As the guy told the story, he just kind of paused. And something came over him that this was the metaphor of my life. I'm out there every day trying to prove myself to someone, prove myself to myself. Does anybody really notice? Now, this is what Proverbs 29:25 is talking about. That's a trap. And thankfully, with the gospel, we have the opportunity to get out of this. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. You and I have the opportunity to say words of life to our spouses. And the reason why our words matter so much to our spouses is because your spouse knows you know them better than anybody else. You also know the dark side of them and their weaknesses. And in light of that context, whenever you have a word of encouragement for somebody, for your spouse, that has a much more profound impact than just anybody else off the street or somebody at work saying something nice to them. A word fitly spoken, like apples of gold in a setting of silver. Or Job, your words have upheld him who was stumbling. You have made firm the feeble knees. To make an apt answer is a joy to a man, and a word in season, how good it is. Power of truth and the power of love. Now, I am not implying that you use the power of truth half the time and the power of love the other half of the time. The power of truth is a rare tool to pull out of the tool bag. Maybe 5% of the time in your interactions, tops. If you have a very teachable spouse, you can do that. And 95% of the time, you're going to be setting an atmosphere of the power of love. The reason that's so important is because whenever you pull out the truth card, because this person has to live with you, this can be very painful for your spouse. This is something you want to pull out on rare occasions. Now, some of you may be sitting there thinking, I've tried to do this speak the truth in love thing, and it never goes well. Now, part of that is on the person that you're married to, and I think part of that is on us. There was a lady that I knew many years ago, and she was in the process of getting a divorce from husband number 4. I was over at their apartment talking to them. Just dropped in to drop something off, I think. And he and I were sitting at the kitchen table, and the lady was vacuuming the living room carpet. And my friend was trying to get her attention about something that was important to him. And she just kept vacuuming the carpet. She said, I'll be in a minute, vacuuming the carpet. I'll be in a minute. Can't you see I'm vacuuming the carpet? I'll be in a minute. And you could just see the look on my friend's face. Now, this lady, if you knew her, was one of the sweetest ladies you'll ever meet. And when she tried to do the truth in love with her husband, it usually went nowhere. Sometimes because of him, and other times because with her, no matter how sweet you try to do this, if the person senses that this relates to my needs, the person knows you well enough, they're going to react. That's just how this is. My nickname for my friend, which I never used publicly with her, obviously, was Vera Vacuum. Something as simple as that. Vera Vacuum. Now, the power of grace is the most powerful of the three tools. Paul says, let no evil talk come out of your mouths. Evil is the same word as rotting. It's that green stuff in the back of your refrigerator, stuff that stinks, should have been thrown out like a week ago. Not that that ever happens at the Gatchell house. As fits the occasion, and then notice the last part of this, that it may impart grace to those who hear. What is grace? Put one of my definitions for grace in your handout. Let's go to that. Grace is the power to know what someone else has done against you and not only forgive them, but relate to them as if it never happened. Sounds like a tall order, doesn't it? It is a tall order. You won't find this out there in the human community among people. How is it that we learn this kind of, how can we garner this kind of power and ability to wield this tool of grace? You read books on it? You go to seminars on it? The way we learn this is by personal experience. When somebody has related to you in grace, when you know they got the goods on you, they could read you the riot act, and they don't. In fact, it seems like they have forgiven you. In fact, it seems like they still like being in your presence. You are tasting grace. And when you taste grace, it will have a profound impact on how you want to relate to the people in your life, including your spouse. Grace. Luke 2:23-34, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. They divided up his clothes by casting lots. It's a very familiar scene. Jesus hanging on the cross, the passers-by coming by and hurling ridicule at him. The two thieves on the cross at the beginning hurling ridicules at him. The Jewish religious leaders hurling ridicules at him. And here he is, in one of the 7 things he says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Now, in one sense, they knew exactly what they were doing. But he's saying something else about them. They do not know what they are doing. What in the world is going on there? That's a picture of grace. Now, as you see that verse, it's likely that you're going to have one of two responses to that particular verse. Response 1, which I hear a lot in our culture out there, is, wow, that's a tremendous example to admire. And that's the kind of relationships I want to have, and I want to emulate that kind of forgiveness for other people. It strikes you as something you want to do. It's a great picture. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that you're not going to really be able to emulate that until you experience it. When you read that verse, he says, Father, forgive them, forgive Seth, for he doesn't know what he is doing. Well, that's a lot different reading. He does know what I'm doing. He knows what I've done. He knows all the darkest sides of me. He knows when I have unleashed my temper on people when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, when I was in college. And at the times I've done that as an adult. He knows every rotten thought I've had about somebody. He knows every doubt I've had about him. He knows every selfish ambition I've had for myself and to get my needs met. He knows every dark desire that I shouldn't have, and every attempt that I've tried to do to fulfill those. He knows all of that stuff. He knows all of the, as my oldest daughter says, crapola of my life. And yet this morning when I woke up, he still wanted to be with somebody like me. When I embrace that, and when I think, nobody treats me like that. Nobody loves me like that. Nobody knows all the darkest side of me like he does, and at the same time wants my presence and relationship with him, in spite of those things, like him. When I experienced that, either many years ago when I became a Christian, or in the morning, when I remind myself of this has a profound influence on how I live my marriage and how I live with my relationships with people in my world. The last part on the back of your handout is the necessity of the gospel as you build a marriage. Psalm 103:10 says, God does not treat us as our sins deserve or repay us according to our iniquities. You've got the goods on your spouse in a lot of ways. If you published a paper, put some stuff out on Facebook or Instagram, you could ruin your spouse' reputation that maybe they've spent decades trying to build. And for the most part, you can be true. But that's not how God is with us. He does not treat us as our sins deserve or repay us according to our iniquities. Let's go down to Romans 8:32, Robert. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, will he not also give us all things with him? I have the ability to torpedo my relationship with God, or at least I think I do. And God says, try me. Our relationship with you is so important. I'm going to move heaven and earth to keep that from happening. And no matter how much you fail or fall flat on your face, Seth, I am committed to you and to making this relationship work. The opposite of this is my old life that I grew up with as a kid and as a teenager and my first 2.5 years in college. Without knowing it, of striving every cotton-picking day to get somebody to notice me, to attend to me, to compliment me, to encourage me, to say something nice about me, to smile, to be grateful, to be impressed day after day, after day, after day, after day, after day. And slowly just wormed my way down into a self-centered lifestyle that I could hardly even see. Not going to build a marriage that way. He saved us, not because of deeds done by us in righteousness, but in virtue of his mercy. By the washing of regeneration and renewing in the Holy Spirit. God knows the best about me, and he wants me, but he also knows the worst about me. His love is not blind. And yet the word of the gospel is nevertheless. Nevertheless, he wants to be with me. Nevertheless, I matter to him. Nevertheless, for all the stuff I've done, I'm important to him. Nevertheless, God wants to use my life to be a blessing to my wife and my kids and the folks that I go to church with and the people that I work with. Nevertheless, in spite of all that I've done, nevertheless, in spite of how I could screw up my life today or tomorrow or this week, nevertheless, the wonder of grace identifies me. That's who we're becoming as Christians. A nevertheless people. Let's pray together. Father, there are probably a lot, maybe some of the folks that are going to hear this message that are been trying to build their marriage. And they've tried the power of truth, the power of love. And or in the path of discovering that what you say in James 1 is true. The anger of man does not accomplish the righteousness of God. Blasting somebody away with their weaknesses and what they're doing just makes things worse. And yet those kind of things just come spewing out of our mouth so easily. And we give lip service to having the tool of love, but most of the time it's a pretty weak tool. As long as somebody does what we want them to do and they love us, then we wield that tool. But if they're not doing their part of the bargain, if they're not making the effort that we think they should, then our tool of love, for the most part, gets left in the tool bag. Trying to build a marriage without the tool of grace. I don't know how you do that. And maybe for some of our folks today, the wonder of the gospel and experiencing the grace of God for you yourself, not for your wife, not for your husband, not for your kids, but Jesus hanging on the cross for you. And knowing everything there is to know about you that he does. Maybe you want to run and hide in shame. And yet if you lift up your eyes to him on the cross, what you'll see is somebody who says, forgive him. Father, forgive her. She doesn't know what she's doing. He doesn't know what he's doing. Grace is something we simply receive. It is simply a gift. It's something we just humbly open our hands to. And we say, thank you. I want to be marked by grace. I want to be identified by grace. I want to be a nevertheless person. In spite of what I've told myself for many years about myself, in spite of what other people have told me about myself, maybe all my life, I want to hear your voice today from the cross that says, Father, forgive, and insert your name. For he knows not what he does. She knows not what she does. And to hear that voice as the top voice in your life, the voice that echoes the loudest in your heart more than any other voice. And to say to God, I don't know why you would love somebody like me. But today, with some laughter in my voice, I say thank you. Let me hear your voice today.
We at Pacific Church of Irvine invite you to join us every Sunday at 9:30. You can also visit our website at pacificchurch.com